Talent development leader. For years, you have trusted ATD to develop your team. Now ATD is elevating its content, communities, and capabilities to develop you. Talent development leader is ATD's brand for your professional development, providing content that fosters and promotes your thought leadership, community that progresses with your career, and capabilities backed by ATD's capability model that keep you on the leading edge of the field. Welcome to ATD's Talent Development Leader podcast, featuring monthly conversations with the greatest influencers in the talent development field. We cover the latest trends, hot topics, and future-focused ideas that current and aspiring TD leaders need to know. Learn more by visiting www.td.org and searching for Talent Development Leader podcast. Today, I'm joined by Amii Barnard-Bahn, who helps executives get promoted to the C-suite and helps companies do the right thing. Amii has been recognized by Thinkers 360 as #1 for career advancement. A former Fortune 5 executive and CHRO, Amii is a consultant and coach to the C-suite and leaders at global companies like Bank of the West, Adobe, AbbVie, and The Gap. She is also a partner at Kaplan & Walker LLP, a law firm specializing in compliance and ethics. Amii is a contributor to Harvard Business Review and a member of Marshall Goldsmith's 100 Coaches. A lifelong diversity advocate, Amii testified for the successful passage of the first U.S. laws requiring corporate boards to include women. Amii earned her law degree from Georgetown University Law Center and her BA from Tufts. Hi, Amii, and thank you for joining me today.
Hey, it's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yes. So earlier this year, we had the pleasure of talking to you, Amii, about career development and some tips and tools for how to advance your career. I encourage listeners to check out that episode of Talent Development Leader podcast if you missed it. And today we get a bonus chat with Amii on an entirely new topic, and one that all of our listeners as TD leaders have identified as top of mind. Last year, ATD surveyed TD execs about some of the biggest challenges they are facing in their work. A resounding theme emerged: change. In fact, one of the pain points these execs shared was managing the pace of change. Yet we've been talking about change and change management and a VUCA world for years. Amii, does it surprise you that leaders are still fixated on this topic of change and struggling to deal with change?
It's a great question because we do hear and see it all the time in the news. You can't really get away from it with everything going on in the world. I would say it doesn't surprise me because from a human psychology standpoint, we don't do very well with change. We seek stability. There are forces called homeostasis, technically, that try to keep us in where we are. Mm-hmm. And they're comforting because I think as humans, we always try to make meaning of things, and we try to take control of our lives as much as possible. And so that requires a bit of a feeling of control and stability. Mm-hmm. However, when we really think about things, I think stability is a bit of a mirage. And I think it's constructed in order for us to have some psychological safety around the world, our relationships, our work. But I think that it is, if we really, really take a hard look, whether you're a parent who has children growing up right in front of you, and that's one of the biggest time markers I've experienced. When you're young and single, you can let 10 years pass pretty quickly. But when you see the little ones growing up around you, that stares you right in the face, right?
Right. Yeah.
And our parents, I think, always told us that too. You grew up so fast, right? That's where that comes from. I think that feeling of we don't want things to change when things are happy, and even when they aren't, sometimes we prefer the devil we know than the devil we don't know. And I think that when we observe change, if we really logically think about it and take out the emotional side, we're choosing to focus on random points in time that comfort us, like that best boss we had at a particular job, and why can't it just be like that again? Why did they have to change this or that? And the benefit of getting older is you do have better perspective. And that's the wisdom if you ever listen to all the fabulous people that are ahead of us in life. They'll look back and be able to say, oh, yes, I was going through a change curve and I didn't realize it at the time, or I didn't see that coming and I should have, right? So there's that sense of false security, I think, that we give ourselves because things are always, always, always changing. The planet, the house around us that seems stable, the company situation that we're in, the market, whether it's war, whether it's supply chain issues, whether it's a friendship where interests are starting to differ. Things just change. And I think that we can't always focus on them all the time. Otherwise, we wouldn't have that stability to move forward. So I hope that I've been thinking that that's a better reference point, I hope, in terms of creating some sense of calm, that's actually the framework is really changes all around us all the time. We sometimes choose to see things as fixed out of necessity. But if change is becoming upsetting, or if it's feeling like we're out of control, I believe flipping it as a framework is actually more honest and I hope more helpful.
I love that. I think that mindset shift or flip is really helpful. I'm coming up on a big birthday. I'm turning 20. So, but no, a milestone year. And I've been thinking about, kind of doing a lot of reflecting on the past. And I realized the amount of kind of revisionist history or rose-colored glasses you wear when you look back on whatever, right? The last decade or, a point of time, as you said. It is so fixed, and it's not real, right? You're not thinking about it holistically or as it actually happened or existed. So, I think that's a really helpful way of framing it and kind of viewing the idea of change. So I've talked to TD execs recently who've suggested we elevate this conversation. So, as I've mentioned, we talked about change. We've talked about change in this field a lot. And Amy, far better than I, how much execs, really struggle with this or need the tools and tips to manage it effectively. And so some folks I was talking to recently suggested instead of change, calling it transition, disruption, transformation. And they suggested that we normalize or deconstruct change. So it's not such a big and seemingly complex concept. And I think, you've touched on this already. What are your thoughts on that, on kind of maybe changing the conversation a little bit as we look ahead to a new year, in a time when people think about such things?
It's a great question. I think that, again, if we assume a baseline that everything is changing to some degrees with greater velocity than others all the time, then it's important more on a personal level, probably, to consider the degree to which it's disruptive. I think it's impossible to ignore and not at least mention the mental health crisis that's occurred for people post-pandemic, the loneliness that is also a key theme for many people right now. And so when we're talking about change today, I don't want to discount that some change can be traumatic for people, whether it's the loss of a parent, the loss of mobility, or long COVID. A lot of colleagues are dealing with that, and that is life-changing. The loss of a job and the way it's handled, as we know, is really critical to whether an event is traumatic or whether it helps us move on. So those are things that I think can be put in a different category. And I would say transformation or disruption is probably somewhere in between. There can be disruptive technologies like AI. There can be, certainly going through the Industrial Revolution was probably traumatic and disruptive for a lot of people. So those things are, I think, skills that executives do possess and cultivate. I think one of the couple of qualities that we see in CEOs that don't always present themselves as much in terms of our wiring, our personalities, is more comfortable with risk, more comfortable with conflict, whether it's having to fire your best friend that co-founded the company with you or leaving a company because you just realize you're not aligned with the board, and it's worse to stay where you are than to not know where you're going. Not everyone's comfortable with that. Many people just stay where they are until they have their, relay race. They're ready to get the baton and they know where they're going. So it can be cultivated. I coach a number of CEOs, and I do notice that they're always, generally, not always, but many times they're one step ahead of everyone else. That's what can make it actually difficult when they need to manage something, because they've been living with a decision or knowledge for so long because they can see further ahead, or they have extra information that's not public around what needs to happen. And so by the time they make the change, they're already through the change curve of, denial, loss, resistance, and their acceptance, and they're ready to go. And often we have to stop them and say, remember, you've been thinking about this for a year. Most people have not. We need to back up, and we need to be patient. We need to handhold. We need to show empathy and sell it and explain why we're doing this. What's the good of the change? Yeah. Because, to be content with changing the status quo, the pain of the status quo has to be greater than the change that's going to come. And you have to see the vision and the positive needs for change. I know this from coaching, right? Some people aren't coachable, and that doesn't mean they're not coachable forever. It just means right now things are okay and there's not a lot of pain. So they're not interested in changing habits that have served them very well, thank you, for maybe 30, 40 years. Yeah. But one of my coaches, and just a brilliant coach who just passed away last year, which was devastating for the community, David Peterson, who founded the coaching program at Google in-house. He has a wonderful quote that I keep in mind. Sometimes this may help people as a mantra when you are finding yourself resisting a change that either you have no control over or you need to make. It's just good for you, for the situation. He used to say, there's no learning in the comfort zone, and there's no comfort in the learning zone. And I love that because it acknowledges that, yes, it's not comfortable, and we're not really learning when we're comfortable. And I think there are different phases. I hope everyone has phases in their life. What I would wish for people is that there are always phases in their life that are comfortable, so they can regroup, they can regenerate, they can think broadly and dream and envision, and that there are times that are healthily anxious, that kick you in the butt, that challenge your frameworks, that help you grow, help you learn what's next for you, and that get you out of that comfort zone. Many of your folks in ATD may be aware of this, but as you know, when we're comfortable and we're not learning, our brain center under brain scans is dark. It's completely dark because our brain's comfortable. We know the pattern, whether it's driving to work. Have you ever driven to work when we used to drive to work? And you didn't remember going there? You didn't. Maybe you were singing a song on the radio. You're thinking about the stuff you have to get done that day. You just don't remember. Versus if you're driving somewhere and you don't know where you're going, like you're on a fabulous trip somewhere, you've never been there. You are looking at the roads, you're noticing an interesting farmhouse, someone selling flowers on the side of the road, whatever it is. It's the same with learning. When we're learning, our brain center lights up. It activates us. And I believe there's a bit of evidence here that it also keeps us young. In terms of older people that do crossword puzzles, Sudoku. I mean, there's all the things about, just keep moving as you get older, and so there are very positive things about living in a time of rapid change. I don't think we have control over that. So I'm an optimistic pragmatist around this. And I think that getting used to a certain level of that while watching for burnout, very important. Just wrote a newsletter on the 3 types of burnout and how to address those. So I want to be clear that I'm not talking about that. That requires special attention. Trauma requires special attention. But the day-to-day change that can exhaust people, I think can be reframed with some of these other positives that we can consider.
Amii, are there any reoccurring themes or trends when it comes to change in the workplace today that you think are important to consider? For example, AI is one major change that you mentioned that organizations are navigating. Are there any others that you have observed?
There are a few. I'd say that more than at any other time, and I think this will continue, we're seeing the decentralization of culture on a broad scale, whether it's music. I was thinking the other day that people of a certain generation all know a particular song because it was played incessantly on the radio DJ queue, and you might have one or two stations in your area if you were lucky. I grew up in a small town in Connecticut, so I literally really only had two to choose from: the classical channel and the classic rock channel. That was it. Yeah. So I learned to like classic rock because I couldn't avoid it, and I liked music. And so songs I don't even like, I know all the words to. My kids don't have that experience. They can pick and choose, create their own playlist. I had to do mixtapes. I mean, that was a cool thing at one point. Yeah. They can pick and choose just that. And their friends aren't necessarily listening to that. There's no, Casey Kasem's top 100 of the year 2023 anymore that we would all recognize. There are good things and bad things about that. The good things are access to creating, and for creators has become democratized. Mm-hmm. And you and I could literally record a song today and probably have it on Spotify. Might not be a great idea, but we could. Right? I mean, 30 years ago, that was heard of. You had to be signed to a recording deal. I mean, I just went to the National African American Museum of Music in Nashville, and the first Black woman was not recorded until 1920 because people didn't think they'd buy the record. Oh. Right? How far we've come. Yeah. And so there are positive things about all of this change. We do lose a sense of shared experience that can lead to, I think, divisiveness and and we're seeing that play out in politics, which is of concern to me very much. So there's pros and cons to that. Switching to something much more specific around talent, a lifespan of a skill is now estimated to be 5 to 7 years. So the good news about that is we're living a lot longer. And so we have time to, again, if we keep active and our health stays, which we need to take better care of. And luckily, there's a lot of good science around that now. We will get to learn more. We'll get to keep those brain synapses firing. Our brains will be healthier than they were, 50, 70, 80 years ago, where you learned one skill and that was it. That isn't actually good for your mortality. So for people who are adaptable, and the Darwin quote is, he was brilliant. It's still accurate. Those who are the most adaptable will survive. That is going to happen more. So I think people in ATD are actually particularly well suited to this because I believe most of us are in this profession because we love learning. Yeah. So you're already adaptable. You're already learning. AI, I think, will be a crutch in some fields for things. I use it for a little bit of testing my research. I don't believe it 100%. I still don't think it's completely trustworthy. It's great for idea generation. What I find when I get scared of a new technology is I need to move towards it. I challenge myself. By the time I was old enough to realize I needed to get over myself on some of this stuff, I learned if I'm afraid of something and it's intellectual or it's a challenge, the better course for me, for my confidence, is to move towards it. Not move away. That makes me shrink, and that makes me feel less. And I may seek out an expert on it. I may, talk to other people. I don't have to know everything. Mm-hmm. Right? When you're in your 20s, you always feel like you have to know everything. Mm-hmm. But in your 30s, you realize, okay, I might not know everything. In your 40s, you laugh at yourself back in your 20s, and you're like, oh gosh, I did some of those silly mistakes. But you do it with love. Yeah. I'm not saying you're condescending to yourself, and then in your 50s and 60s, you can see it even more in 70s, I think, going forward. Not there yet, but look forward to it. I hope, knock on wood. It's a privilege to grow old. Yeah. And so I think that those things are things that I've seen. I think that it's important for people to set boundaries on their time. There's never been more and more distractions. We keep media, we keep unchosen media out of our home as much as possible. For example, that's one boundary that became very clear to me when I had kids. We haven't had a regular TV since they were born. We have a couple of cable channels, and we intentionally choose to watch TV. I get my news from reading. I don't watch it, especially the way that TV has become entertainment. News has become, I prefer to process the news in a factual way and choose my sources and double cross-check them. Try not to have an echo chamber. That can be the risk there. But yeah, I guess those are some things I would point out that I've seen.
I think just kind of recapping where we've been in this conversation, understanding that obviously change is an inevitable constant, reframing the idea of change or your perspective of change as if to expect it and embrace it. And the idea that when you're in the midst of change, you're learning, right? So it's uncomfortable, but
and that's okay.
Lean into it, right?
I'm uncomfortable and that's okay. This is normal. We're not programmed to like change. It's how we survived. So it's literally lizard brain stuff. Yeah. The resistance to change is lizard brain stuff. And so if we accept that and accept that the structures that we've set up, whether it's literally the calendar, BC, before there's a very funny segment by now canceled comedian C.K. Lewis on how the calendar was set. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's one of the funniest bits of comedy I've ever seen. It's a random point in time, how we literally count time. Yeah. Quarterly earnings calls for companies. How run ragged are people by publicly traded company earnings calls? Right. It runs your life if you're in finance or if you're in sales. It's a random point in time we've picked. Does it impact you? Yes, absolutely. And it's important to remember that these are constructs that evolved over time. Other cultures have different ones. And I think if you it's kind of fascinating if you look at it that way, that gosh, we needed some structure. There really wasn't structure. Right. And things are shifting within that all the time because we've actually are laying this infrastructure on top of something, and it's really quite fragile. And it's better to I think that gives us some choice to, again, set our own boundaries, do some self-reflection on, is this change actually going to lead to some positive results? Or am I burning out? And do I need to get some help for that? Like, we do need to be responsible for how change is impacting us. And I think we need to overall take a positive view of it. Otherwise, it can just be a real sinker for people's attitude and mindset. And we've got to keep that growth mindset.
And you've mentioned managing major change initiatives over multiple Fortune 500 companies and some of those coaching experiences with executives. And you've learned a lot about the topic throughout your career journey as well. What are some practical tips you can share with TD leaders about how to build momentum for change and how to make change initiatives in their organizations last?
Great question. The critical thing for leading a change initiative, number one, is to either create or already have existing a sense of urgency. And Cotter pointed this out. And after leading so many change initiatives, some of which failed happily, so great learning experience, and then watching others, it is usually because there is a lack of urgency or momentum for a project. And so I've grown wiser through those. I had a change initiative years ago at an organization and built a business case for it, a white paper. It was rock solid, and shopped it around to all the executives. And I couldn't get anyone excited about it. I couldn't believe it. It's going to save time, save money. What I didn't know was that there were other huge initiatives already getting underway. And I wasn't on the executive team at that time. So I was the iceberg, it was below the surface kind of thing. 2 years later, to my surprise, after I had fallen out of love with the project, it's like an ex-boyfriend. I'm like, forget it. I'm not talking to you again. You broke my heart. I was so excited, forget it. And my head of HR came to me and said, hey, we're ready now. And I'm like, ready for what? My momentum's gone, and they're like, no, we're ready. And it's a great moment because I realized, oh, okay. Sometimes urgency can take 2 years to build in a Fortune 500 company. And they didn't forget about me, but it wasn't their most important thing. It's my most important thing, but it doesn't mean it's their most important thing. And whoever has the power makes the decision. I got to make peace with that. So I came back and I got to launch it. I got my enthusiasm back up and it was fantastic. And so that was one lesson learned. The other lesson is you've got to have sponsorship. You have to have powerful sponsorship, or even if there's some urgency, it's things that can go sideways, or indirect hits can kind of sink the project. And so building your sponsorship team, if you've got the urgency, that is number 2, but so close to critical. And then there are a few other things. I reduced Cotter's 8 points down to 5. I think 8's just kind of a lot. Not to criticize the man. He's fantastic. And, being in corporate, we kind of got, so I have that on my website. I actually have a 3-minute change video that kind of walks through that and the change curve, how to make sure it sticks, how to make sure it sticks is walking people through the change curve. There are different ways you need to address each quadrant of the U-shaped change curve, which I'm sure your audience is familiar with. If not, I've got it all on this video. And then the critical part that a lot of people forget is that there is a next stage to the project once the project's over. And it's not just the debrief and the delta on, okay, what we do differently, what do we do well, yada, yada. It's how are we going to keep measuring, like 3, 6, 9 months later? Did the change stick? How's it working? What's changed? What might we need to tweak so that it ages well? And what feedback are our users, whatever the user internal client base is. That's how you make sure it sticks, because people know you still care, you're listening, you're checking in. It's very valuable as a change leader to eat what you cook and to continue to, I don't know, you could think of it as the top of your wedding cake. You put it in the freezer for a year, you take it back out, and does it still taste good? And it's kind of like that with change. Was this still good? Did I get the results I thought as a leader? That is gold, because we all go into these things, or we get tasked with them. We get voluntold. And then the real lessons learned, the deep ones, I think, can come up to a year, 2 years later, and they can be very subtle. And they're not, in your face like they were when you were managing the change. And you can learn so much from that.
So we've already made this a little personal, and talking about how individuals who are listening can really think about, reframe, and manage change in their own lives. As with anything we do well in our work, we have to start with ourselves. So kind of based on what you've shared, these tips, managing change initiatives in organizations, how can TD leaders better prepare themselves to be more resilient and to lead folks through ambiguity with grace?
The first thing is listening. People do need to express. Not everyone has the same level of experience with change or change capacity. And I do think that life stage and the degree to which people have sought out or experienced change in their lives, those are 2 major factors. You can have someone who's in their 50s who's been in the same job the whole time, or you can have someone in their 20s who just doesn't have that much life experience, but they're more open, maybe, right? So listening, really quantifying what's being asked. What is the change? That's usually people's first question. It's awful when people don't really know how it's going to impact them. That causes anxiety. So when you're leading a change or supporting an executive with a change, I think reminding them to be a bit patient. And they're usually like, well, I'll be a little patient, but not a lot patient. They need to just do this, And so sometimes you have to front face or interface that a little bit, depending on how large the scale is. I was leading one project, I remember, and I had a detractor on my project team that was very critical in one aspect of the project. It was an IT change, and only this one person could do it. They didn't have a team reporting to them. They'd been there forever. They knew where all the IT skeletons were buried, all the things. I had to get them on board. We'd get on these calls, cross geographies. It was driven by legal, so it was a mandated change. It wasn't particularly sexy or exciting or saving the company money. Those are tough.
Yeah.
And so I didn't even know this guy from Adam. So I finally just thought, I don't know what's going on here. So I called him up and I just said, hey, do you want to go out for coffee? And we did. And we didn't talk about the project at all. I just wanted to get to know him. I I thought, okay, what are his interests? What's his role in the company? It's a massive company. It's like 80,000 person company, right? And after that he was great. I honestly just think he needed to feel appreciated. He'd been in a single contributor role his whole life, and he was very good at what he did. And he's getting lost in the shuffle, as people do. And he didn't recognize it, so he wasn't seeking other ways to satisfy that need, which is what I would have, coached him to do. If he was my coachee. You can't expect your job to give you everything. And so those are some things I would look out for.
Amii, you mentioned your website and your 5-step model, and I know you've been doing coaching and working with execs and with change for years. Can you tell listeners a little bit more about how they might connect with you, some resources you could share with them via your website or other places they can go to learn more?
Sure. Well, first of all, I love connecting with learning professionals on LinkedIn. So please just connect with me. I'll check out. I usually look at, what people do. And if they're an HR or learning person, I just immediately connect. I always love a personal note, and, it's okay if you don't. My website is Barnard-Bahn, all one word, BARNARDBAHN.com. Or you could just Google Amii, AMII, and happily, very few people have that name. So you can literally just Google Amii HBR, Amii Coaching, and you'll see some of my articles and things. And then on my website, I've got a whole library of resources. If you just go to the top, it says resources. You can sort by podcast, so you'll be on there. You can sort by articles, by in the news. I just did one I was in the Financial Times yesterday, so that'll be in there. There's web stuff. I wrote a book a few years ago. There's information on that. There's like hundreds of free resources. I have a newsletter that I publish both on LinkedIn, and I also have a client newsletter. So I have 2 of them that people can subscribe to if they like, or all past issues are also on that. And then the couple that I mentioned, if you like, I'm happy to send you the links and you can put them in the show notes.
Well, thank you, Amii, so much for your time today. This was a really thoughtful conversation. I appreciate the insights and new perspectives you brought to the idea of change. I know our listeners will find a lot of value from this, and thank you. I hope to get you back on here again in 2024.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast by the Association for Talent Development. If you found this show insightful or useful, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with a colleague.